On an autumn morning in 1944, at a military prison camp set amidst the arid plains of Texas, USA, dozens of German female prisoners of war sat intently at wooden tables, some sewing and embroidering, others learning to repair typewriters or carefully cutting fabric to make shirts. A few were softly practicing English phrases. "Good morning, how are you?" Beneath the simple tin roof, the clatter of sewing machines mingled with gentle chatter, forming a scene so peaceful, so quietly surreal, that it seemed impossible to believe all these women were prisoners of Nazi Germany. Standing at the doorway, Liesel, a new prisoner transferred to the camp just the day before, froze in astonishment. She couldn't believe her eyes. In her mind still lingered images of prison camps, barbed wire, hunger, punishment, everything a captured soldier deserved at the hands of the enemy. And yet here, in the heart of America, her comrades, once seized by U.S. troops, were being taught trades, learning a new language, and even seemed grateful. Liesel frowned, 1,000 questions and doubts rising within her. How could this be? Had they forgotten who their captors were? But little by little, she too would come to experience a quiet, jarring cultural shock, one that would begin to shatter the worldview she had once held so firmly. Just a few months before arriving at Camp Hearne, Liesel had been standing in the midst of the smoke-filled battlefield of Normandy, carrying with her a vague, gnawing fear of what lay ahead. As a logistics assistant in the German army, she had been captured along with many of her comrades when the front line collapsed. News that they would be transported to the United States, the enemy across the ocean, only deepened everyone's anxiety. But, upon arrival, instead of punishment or forced labor, Liesel was given a clean bed and regular meals. Life in the camp was so unexpectedly orderly and calm that she wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or unsettled. The first days at Hearne passed quietly. Each morning, the female prisoners lined up for roll call before dispersing to their daily routines, light chores, cooking, sweeping the yard. Liesel assumed this life would be dull and temporary until she heard a rumor that an English class was being offered inside the camp. At first, she thought it was a joke. But one morning, while she was sweeping, an American woman appeared at the gate, modestly dressed, gentle-eyed, and soft-spoken. Her name was Elizabeth, a volunteer from a nearby town who had come to teach English to the German prisoners. Liesel froze. Teach English to prisoners of war? She almost thought she'd misheard. The very idea of a language class run by the enemy struck her as both absurd and suspicious. For what purpose? Was it a tool for re-education? A test of loyalty? The questions circled in her mind all day long. The first lesson took place right in the camp's dining hall during a break from the daily work routine. About a dozen prisoners gathered around the wooden tables, mostly men with a few women from communications units like Liesel's. Elizabeth stood at the front, 2 tables pushed together as a makeshift lectern, and in neat white chalk wrote on the blackboard, "English class." "I quit." "Good morning," she said with a smile, her voice as light as the morning breeze. A brief silence hung in the air. Then came a few shy, clumsy replies from the back of the room. "Gut morning." Elizabeth smiled gently, patiently correcting each syllable. "Good morning." At the end of the table, Liesel sat still, clutching the edge of her shirt. Inside her was a quiet turmoil. Part of her resisted. Why should she learn the language of the enemy? She was German. She had served in the army. She had been taught that the American tongue was something to be wary of, a tool of propaganda. But another part of her, quieter, long buried, was stirring. The part that had once dreamed of learning a foreign language in girlhood before the war had swallowed everything. The lesson continued with simple vocabulary, names of objects, greetings, counting from 1 to 10. Elizabeth handed out sheets with pictures and phonetic transcriptions. Liesel stared at the word apple and almost unconsciously began repeating it to herself like a child. Apple, apple. Back home, she had once wished for a book like this. Though still cautious, she began to listen more closely. Elizabeth's voice was steady and soft, not preachy, not condescending. It wasn't the voice of a conqueror. It was the voice of a woman trying to offer something, a gesture of kindness or perhaps just a way to fill the long, dragging days with something that felt meaningful. And it was that very gentleness that unsettled Liesel the most. In the days that followed, the English class became a familiar gathering spot for Liesel. The awkwardness and hesitation of that first session faded. Now, she looked forward to stepping into the makeshift classroom with its worn blackboard and hastily arranged benches. Each lesson felt like a doorway to something new, not just vocabulary or grammar, but an entire cultural world she had never been allowed to explore. Elizabeth did more than teach vocabulary. She told stories, small glimpses into American life. She spoke of how people greet each other at the supermarket, of a child's first day at school, even of the way Americans drink their coffee in the morning. One day, she brought a large map and spread it out across the tables, then pointed to it with a wooden ruler. "This is Texas," she said, tapping the spot. "Where you are now, wide open land, lots of sun, cotton fields, and cattle." Then she moved the ruler northeast. "And this is New York, home of the Statue of Liberty." Liesel went quiet. That name, the Statue of Liberty, had appeared in her German school books, but only as a hollow symbol, dismissed by Nazi propaganda as the face of so-called fake freedom. Yet when Elizabeth spoke the word freedom, her eyes lit up. There was nothing hollow in her voice. She said it like she believed it, gently, sincerely, and something about that made Liesel uneasy. For the first time, she began to wonder if what she had been taught was not entirely true. At the end of each class, Elizabeth often closed with a children's song or an old American folk tune. "To practice pronunciation," she said, "and maybe lift our spirits a little." Once, she brought a small hand-cranked phonograph and played "You Are My Sunshine." The simple melody filled the wooden room. A warm American voice sang from the machine. On the board, Elizabeth chalked out the lyrics and broke them down syllable by syllable. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." The class repeated the words. At first, the sounds were awkward, mangled. Then came laughter. Even Liesel laughed. She sang along, stumbled over the syllables, and felt something rise inside her, a strange lightness, a genuine joy. For the first time since being captured, she laughed not out of sarcasm or nervousness, but because the moment was harmless, innocent. She laughed at herself, a German prisoner of war who once braced for cruelty, now singing an American song about sunlight. Something in her began to soften. And in that moment, Liesel realized the most profound shock wasn't violence or deprivation. It was being treated with unexpected kindness, as a human being. But learning didn't stop with English. Inside the camp, prisoners were encouraged to join a range of classes. Each American POW camp had its own educational program, something unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. Educated German officers were permitted to teach mathematics, physics, history, even philosophy. Some camps had wall newspapers, theater groups, orchestras, soccer teams, all organized by the prisoners themselves under the camp's supervision. At Hearne, Liesel enrolled in a sewing course taught by a former tailor from Hamburg. She learned how to draft patterns, cut fabric, and adjust machines. Every lesson made the days go by faster, and more importantly, helped her feel a little less useless. What surprised Liesel the most was learning that some of her fellow prisoners were taking correspondence courses, actual university classes, with the camp's support. A few even earned credits from the University of Texas, and after the war, those credits were recognized when they returned to Germany. The Americans are educating their prisoners, Liesel thought quietly. Not through force, but with books, pens, and trust. Slowly, between language lessons, fabric cutting sessions, and American country songs, something in Liesel began to shift. Not suddenly, but little by little, the world inside her started to crack open, and a quiet light began to seep in. A few months later, Liesel joined the camp's light-duty work program. In accordance with the Geneva Convention, POWs were encouraged to work and were paid a small wage, about 80 cents a day, redeemable only at the camp canteen. To Liesel, this wasn't just symbolic income. It was a way to be useful, to make the days feel less aimless. She and a small group were assigned to tend the vegetable garden behind the camp, rows of cabbage, tomatoes, onions, and green beans. Every morning, they put on wide-brimmed cloth hats and gloves, quietly working the soil under the Texas sun. At first, Liesel kept her distance from the guards. She hadn't forgotten she was a prisoner, and they were American soldiers. But over time, the stiff glances softened into silent observation, then into quiet astonishment. The guards didn't bark orders. They were younger than she expected, some barely 19 or 20, and most simply watched, in the literal sense. One morning, while struggling to push a wheelbarrow full of fertilizer through a muddy patch, the wheel sank deep into the ground. Liesel gritted her teeth and tried to lift it, to no avail. Suddenly, a young African-American soldier approached without a word, grabbed the handles, and helped her push it through the muck. When they were done, he gave her a quiet nod and returned to his post. Liesel stood frozen. In the propaganda films she'd seen back in Germany, black people were portrayed as inferior, savages under American rule. But now, here was a black American soldier helping her, a former German army assistant, with calm and no trace of hostility. That small act felt as if someone had wiped the dust from the lenses through which she had seen the world for so long. From that moment on, the tension in her heart began to ease. Liesel started trying out simple English phrases, thank you, good morning. And through those outdoor work shifts, she began meeting local civilians, the so-called enemy Americans she had been taught to fear. One day, Liesel and 3 fellow prisoners were assigned to work at a nearby cotton farm. Around noon, under the sweltering summer sun, the farm owner, an older American woman with sun-weathered skin and a brisk gait, came out and invited them inside to rest. She poured each of them a glass of cold lemonade, then pointed to a photo of her son in uniform hanging on the wall. "He is fighting in Europe," she said, her voice softening. There was no anger in her tone, only longing. Liesel looked at the woman and felt a lump rise in her throat. Across the ocean, there were mothers like her own, waiting silently for their sons to return. On the way back to camp, she asked to stop by the roadside to pick a small bouquet of wildflowers. When she handed the bouquet to the woman, as a quiet thank you, the woman pulled her into an embrace, eyes glistening. Not long after, Liesel signed up for a sewing class held in the camp. The administrators explained that such vocational classes were not just to pass the time, they were meant to help prisoners prepare for life after the war, for a peaceful world that to many at the time still felt like a distant dream. The class was held in a small hut at the edge of the camp, outfitted with sewing machines, thread, and scraps of fabric donated by the Red Cross. The instructor was a soft-spoken, patient American woman who taught them how to use the clattering Singer sewing machines. Liesel had never touched one before, but soon she was cutting fabric, guiding seams and stitching pillowcases and aprons to be used in the camp kitchen. One day the teacher brought in a stack of small floral fabrics, soft pinks and mint greens. "Today," she said gently, "we are making children's clothes. They will go to the Red Cross, for children affected by the war." The class fell silent. Liesel lowered her gaze and ran her fingers across the fabric. Her nephew had been born just before she enlisted. She had never met him. Stitch by stitch, she worked in silence. No one said a word, but each woman seemed to pour her homesickness into every seam. When Liesel folded the final tiny shirt, she pictured a hungry German child wearing it, and for a brief moment, her heart felt a little lighter. For Liesel, those classes were not just about learning a skill. They became a quiet form of therapy. In that space, filled with the hum of sewing machines, her vague anxieties began to soften. The war still raged beyond the barbed wire, but here, among women who had once stood on opposite sides, there was a strange, steady quiet, the sound of hope. It wasn't just sewing class, the camp also encouraged prisoners to develop their personal talents. Liesel was surprised to discover how many fellow inmates were gifted. Some sketched with charcoal scraps, others played the piano like real musicians, and a few spent weeks patiently carving wooden sculptures using dull knives improvised from spoon handles. At first, they lacked everything. Paints were made from toothpaste mixed with beetroot, and canvases were pieced together from cardboard scraps. But when the camp commander found out, he made an exception, allowing supplies like paint, brushes, canvas, and carving tools to be brought in from a nearby town. The day they received the art supplies, many prisoners couldn't hide their excitement. The camp buzzed with energy. The art lovers quickly set up easels, spreading color across the mess hall walls. They painted scenes of the American West, cowboys in Stetson hats riding through dusty plains, the Statue of Liberty far off in the east, and Texas bluebonnets blooming along the barbed wire fences. The carvers sat quietly under the shade, shaping wood into horses, dogs, and sometimes babies with dolls' figures that combined memories of their homeland with new, unfamiliar forms. Liesel wasn't artistic herself, but she loved wandering through these little workshops in her free time. Every time she entered the mess hall, saw the murals stretching up to the rafters, or the playful wooden figures neatly arranged on shelves, she smiled. Not because they were beautiful, but because they existed as proof that in a place meant only for suffering, people could still create and preserve their humanity. For her, that was something she had never known under years of rigid propaganda. And it seemed that these humble images, a hand-sewn apron, a mural of Texas, a small carved figure in the dining hall, were slowly cracking the invisible wall inside her, little by little each day. In those fleeting moments, between an American mother and a German prisoner, there were no enemies, no sides. Just two human beings, each carrying memories and quiet kindness, standing face to face without needing explanation. During her labor shifts, Liesel also earned 80 cents a day in the form of coupons, a small wage used for purchases at the camp's canteen. It was a modest store, offering soap, cigarettes, and a few snacks. On her first visit, Liesel was astonished to find ice cream and Coca-Cola, two things long vanished from wartime Germany. She hesitated, then decided to get both, a sweet, creamy ice cream cone and a cold, fizzy Coke. Sitting on the barracks porch, licking her ice cream and sipping her first ever taste of soda, she felt an unexpected lightness inside. In a letter home, Liesel wrote, "In the midst of war, in a prison camp, I just ate ice cream and drank Coca-Cola. I realize I'm lucky to have been captured by the Americans, not the other side." That small joy was enough for her to understand that even in the impermanence of captivity, there was still room for something that felt like hope. Christmas 1944 arrived in a quiet yet warm atmosphere at Camp Hearne. Though far from home, the German prisoners were allowed to celebrate the holiday as tradition. To their surprise, the American command not only approved but even helped prepare for it. A large Christmas tree was set up in the dining hall, and each barracks received a smaller, simply decorated tree. On the evening of the 24th, prisoners and American guards attended a joint service at the camp chapel. The hymn, Silent Night, was sung in both German and English, moving many to tears. Liesel stood beside an American nurse. The two held hands as they wept together. In that moment, the lines between enemy and ally seemed to fade away. The next morning, the prisoners were treated to a special meal: roast chicken, fruitcake, candy, and a white handkerchief embroidered with snowflakes, a small gift that brought Liesel to tears. She thought of her mother back home and wondered whether she had enough to eat this winter. That afternoon, Liesel wrote a letter home. "I attended Mass, ate cake, and even roast chicken. Don't worry, Mama, I'm safe here, but I haven't heard anything from the family. And my heart is heavy." That night, she realized something profound in the prison camp of the enemy. She was living more safely and comfortably than many of her fellow Germans back home. The kindness she had received was unraveling everything she had once been taught about the enemy. A few days later, during a documentary screening organized by the camp, Liesel and many others sat in stunned silence as footage of liberated Nazi concentration camps appeared on the screen. A wave of shock and revulsion hit them as the undeniable truth unfolded before their eyes. Liesel wept. All her mental defenses collapsed. It was a turning point, a moment when a young German woman dared to confront the ideals she had once believed in. When the summer of 1945 began, news of Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender quickly reached Camp Hearne. The war had ended, a bloody chapter closed. For Liesel, emotions were mixed relief that the bombs had stopped, but also an unease about what came next. She was no longer a prisoner of war, but a citizen of a defeated Germany, awaiting repatriation with an uncertain future ahead. As the day of departure neared, Liesel quietly packed her belongings, a few worn clothes, her journal, the handkerchief from Christmas Eve, a lavender soap bar half-used, and an empty Coca-Cola bottle. Each item held a memory, proof that what she had experienced here was real. One of her roommates carefully kept her own Coke bottle, stamped "Property of U.S. Army," as a treasured relic to one day tell her children a story from a most unlikely wartime chapter. Before their farewell, the camp commander, the same man who had welcomed them months ago, gathered the prisoners, thanked them, and wished them safe travels. Liesel stepped forward with tears in her eyes, shook his hand, and said in simple English, "Thank you." He smiled and replied, "Good luck, Liesel." The train pulled away, carrying Liesel and hundreds of other Germans back to Europe. Through the small window, she looked back at the Texas landscape slowly receding behind, once a prison camp, but also the place that had opened a completely different world to her. She told herself she would never forget the lessons she had learned there, about humanity, education, and the true meaning of freedom. All of them came from what she once thought of as the enemy. Returning to a devastated Germany, Liesel reunited with her family and gradually reintegrated into a new life. Thanks to her fluency in English and understanding of American culture, she found work as a translator for the local government under Allied administration. Her experiences in the US became a precious part of her life, a story she would later pass on to her children and grandchildren. A strange, paradoxical tale, but one filled with human warmth amid the darkness of war. Like the train that once took her away from Camp Hearne, Liesel's story too eventually came to a quiet close, but its echo lingered. From a girl once full of blind hatred and deep-rooted prejudice, she had gone through a surprising awakening. The things she never thought possible, being taught English by an American, receiving ice cream and Coca-Cola, being gifted an embroidered handkerchief on Christmas Eve, became the very things that slowly opened her to a new world. There were no grand speeches or political debates, only small gestures. A gentle look, a children's song, a cold drink on a summer day, or the weathered hand of a black American guard helping her push a manure cart, all were enough to stir her heart and begin to change it. The Americans did not have to convince her that her old ideology was wrong. They simply lived their values and let her come to the realization on her own. Amid barbed wire fences, sewing lessons, the tender refrain of "You are my sunshine," and the warm scent of roast chicken on a winter night, Liesel discovered something she had never truly understood before. Compassion has no nationality, and true victory does not come from weapons, but from empathy and human dignity. Years later, as a mother herself, perhaps in a small kitchen somewhere in Germany, Liesel would still keep the old handkerchief or the empty Coca-Cola bottle on a wooden shelf as an enduring fragment of memory. And maybe, when telling her children about those days, she would smile, a smile tinged with both sorrow and gratitude. Time passed, the war became history, and witnesses grew fewer. But from the small story of a former prisoner of war, one can still draw a quiet lesson, that sometimes what has the power to change a whole generation is not argument or authority, but a heart that chooses not to hate. And perhaps, in today's divided world, that lesson is still waiting to be heard once more.